Imagine being handed the deed to land that hasn't seen dry soil in 6 years. Land buried under a grey sheet of prairie water, so still it looks like the sky fell down and forgot to get back up. That is exactly what happened to Clara Whitfield the Tuesday after her grandfather's funeral. 41 years old, 2 months out of a marriage that had quietly bled her dry and already 2 payments behind on her car. And still, even with all of that, she held on. Because sometimes the thing everyone tells you to abandon is the only thing worth keeping. The office of Morrison and Keel barristers smelled like old carpet and burnt coffee. Clara, 41, sat across from Morris Webb, 68, the estate lawyer who had handled Amos Whitfield's affairs for the better part of 3 decades. Next to her sat her brother, Nigel, 44, who had driven up from Calgary in a rental car and spent the first 20 minutes of the reading checking his phone. Morris cleared his throat. Per the terms of the estate, he began, the checking and savings accounts totaling approximately $47,000, as well as the 2018 pickup truck and the woodworking equipment in the garage, are left in equal shares to Nigel and Clara Whitfield. He shuffled a page. The Whitfield homestead property, all 182 acres in Lacey County, including all structures thereon, is left solely and entirely to Clara. Nigel looked up from his phone for the first time all morning. Sorry, which property are we talking about? The original homestead, off County Road 9. That thing's been underwater since 2019, Nigel said. He wasn't wrong. 6 consecutive wet springs and a beaver dam the municipality kept promising to address had turned the lower third of the Whitfield farm into a permanent slough. The old threshing barn stood on the higher ground, but just barely. The farmhouse foundation had cracked in the 2nd year of flooding. The provincial government had quietly added the area to a watch list for ecological sensitivity designation, which was bureaucratic shorthand for don't count on developing this anytime soon. It's a write-off, Nigel said, leaning back in his chair. He said it the way people say things they've already decided. Clara, be realistic. You can't live there. You can't sell it, not for anything decent, and the tax burden alone is going to be a nightmare. Grandpa Amos always had a soft spot for you, but this isn't a gift, it's a liability. Clara kept her eyes on the folder on Morris's desk. She hadn't slept properly in weeks. Between the divorce settlement, the legal bills, and the month she'd taken off from teaching to help care for Amos. At the end, her savings account had a number in it that made her feel slightly ill when she looked at it. 182 acres of flooded prairie wasn't going to solve any of that. But she thought about her grandfather's hands, the way he'd press his palm flat to the soil after a rainfall, like he was listening through it. He used to say, "The land doesn't forget what you put into it, Clara Bird. Not ever." He'd said it so many times over so many summers at the homestead that it had become something she stopped really hearing. The way you stop hearing a song you love too much. "I'll take it," Clara said. Nigel exhaled through his nose. "You'll take a flooded field. I'll take the farm." Morris slid the transfer documents across the desk without comment. He had been doing this long enough to know when a decision was already made. 2 kilometers down County Road 9, Clara pulled onto the gravel shoulder and got out of her car. The wind off the flatlands hit her immediately. Cold and sharp even in April, and she stood at the edge of where the fence line used to be, staring out at what remained of the Whitfield homestead. It was worse than she'd pictured. The slough had expanded over the winter, swallowing the lower pasture entirely and pushing up close to the base of the old threshing barn. The barn itself still stood, its red paint faded to a dusty orange, its roof sagging on the west end, but the water lapped at its foundation stones like it was making a case. The farmhouse was gone in any practical sense. The first floor had been gutted by standing water years ago, and no one had bothered with it since. Amos had known this. He'd moved into the assisted living facility in Moose Jaw 2 years before he died, and had never once mentioned selling. Had never let Nigel put in an offer either, and Nigel had tried. Clara had always assumed that was sentimentality, Now she wondered if it was something else. She sat on the hood of her car for a long time, watching the water sit perfectly still in the grey afternoon light. She cried a bit, not about the farm, but about everything else. The accumulated weight of the past 18 months pressing out through her chest. The marriage, the loneliness, the particular exhaustion of being 41 and starting over from a number close to 0. But when the sun broke through the clouds and hit the slough at a low angle, turning the water to copper and amber, something quieter settled in behind the grief. She was here. The land was here. That was still something. She was not going to sell. The first call came 11 days later. A man named Desmond Holt introduced himself as a representative of Meridian Acquisitions Group, a private land management company based out of Regina. He had a smooth, unhurried way of speaking that Clara associated with people who had never had to hurry for anything. "We've been acquiring agricultural and wetland parcels in the Lacey County Basin," Desmond explained. "We understand the Whitfield property recently changed hands, and we'd like to make a straightforward offer, $60,000. Cash equivalent, clean transfer, no cleanup obligation on your end." Clara thought about $60,000. It was almost exactly the number that would clear her divorce debt and let her breathe for a year. "I'll think about it," she said. "Of course, take your time." She didn't call back. Desmond called again 3 weeks later, $80,000. Then, when the spring thaw showed no sign of draining the slough, $95. The escalation bothered her in a way she couldn't quite name. If the land was worthless, as Nigel kept reminding her every time they spoke, then why was a private acquisitions firm calling her every few weeks with a higher number? Companies like Meridian didn't make emotional decisions. They made financial ones, which meant something about those 182 flooded acres was worth considerably more than the offers suggested. She started going through Amos's papers. He had kept everything in a set of filing boxes that Clara had taken from the assisted living facility and stored in her apartment. Financial records, seed catalogs, land surveys going back to the 1940s. Letters in Ukrainian she couldn't fully read, though she'd taken enough of the language in childhood to recognize the formal, careful handwriting of her great-great-grandfather, Mykola Whitfield, born Mykola Billick, renamed at the immigration office in Winnipeg in 1921, the way so many Ukrainian settlers had been. There was a letter dated September 1932, addressed to Mykola's eldest son from a lawyer in Weyburn. Clara's Ukrainian wasn't good enough to get all of it, but she understood enough. Words for safe, for barn, for do not trust, and one phrase she had to look up that meant, roughly, what the earth holds, the earth keeps. She read that phrase 4 times. She thought about Desmond and his rising offers. She thought about the threshing barn, the oldest structure on the property, built by Mykola himself in 1924, which had survived 6 years of flooding on its original stone foundation. She called Morris. "Do you know anything about a company called Meridian Acquisitions?" she asked. Morris was quiet for a moment. "I know the name. They've been active in Lacey County for about 2 years. Picking up distressed properties, mostly, agricultural land with encumbrances, floods, contamination orders, that sort of thing. Who owns them?" Another pause. "I'd have to look into that." He called back 2 days later. The registered owner of Meridian Acquisitions Group was a numbered company. The sole director of that numbered company was a man named Desmond Holt, whose given name at birth, she found this in a 20-year-old property dispute filing Morris unearthed from provincial court records, was Desmond Holtwick. Holtwick. She said it out loud in her kitchen. It didn't mean anything to her immediately. But that night, working through Amos's papers with a Ukrainian English dictionary open on her phone, she found another letter, this one from Mykola to his son Ivan, dated 1938. And there, in the middle of a passage about land taxes and township records, was a name, Holtwick. Nu devirie yomu, do not trust him. The Holtwick who had surveyed Mykola's land in 1927 and tried to reclassify 40 acres of it as Crown land. The Holtwick who had gone to court twice trying to have the homestead deed annulled. He had lost both times, but apparently the family had a long memory. Clara sat for a long time at her kitchen table, the papers spread out around her, her tea going cold. What the earth holds, the earth keeps. The municipality finally cleared the beaver dam at the end of July. It took another 6 weeks, but by early September the slough had drained enough that the lower third of the Whitfield property was muddy earth again, rather than open water. The threshing barn's foundation was fully exposed for the first time in years, dark grey fieldstones, mortared together by someone who had built things to last. Clara drove out the same day the road barricade came down. She had taken a leave from teaching for the semester, something she couldn't quite afford, but couldn't not do. She put on rubber boots and walked the property for 2 hours, pulling out dead cattails, cataloguing what could be salvaged, trying to understand what she'd inherited. On the 3rd day of working the property, Desmond came. He was a tall man, early 50s, in dark trousers and a light jacket that was entirely wrong for a muddy farm in September. He picked his way carefully along the edge of the newly exposed ground, grimacing each time his shoe sank into the soft earth, and Clara watched him from the doorway of the barn with her arms crossed. "Miss Whitfield," he said, stopping a few meters away. He had that smile that never quite reached his eyes. "I'm glad I caught you. I've been meaning to come in person." "You've been calling plenty." "Yes." He glanced past her, quickly, just a flicker, toward the back wall of the barn, toward the north foundation corner. "I want to extend a final offer, $140,000. That's considerably more than market value for land in this condition, and I think you know that." Clara studied him. She noticed the direction of his eyes. "Why do you want it, Desmond?" He blinked. People like Desmond weren't used to being called by their first names by people they considered beneath them. "Meridian has a strategic interest in this part of the county. That's the script. I'm asking you the real reason." She kept her voice even. "Because you've offered me 60, then 80, then 95, and now 140, and I've said no every time. So either you're very bad at business, or there's something here worth a lot more than you're letting on." Something moved behind Desmond's eyes, not anger exactly, more like recalibration. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "The province is reviewing the ecological sensitivity designation on this whole basin. There's a real chance they freeze all private transactions in this area within the year. If that happens, you'll be stuck with land you can't sell, can't develop, and can't afford to maintain." He took a single step toward her. "Take the money, Miss Whitfield. Walk away clean." "My great-great-grandfather built this barn," Clara said, "and your great-grandfather spent 15 years trying to take it from him. I'm not particularly interested in finishing that story the way your family wanted it to go." She watched the color shift in his face. "Have a safe drive back to Regina," she said, and turned back to the barn. She found it 4 days later. She had rented a pressure washer to clear the accumulated silt and clay from the barn's foundation stones. Years of flood sediment packed into every crack and crevice. She worked methodically along the north wall, blasting the mud loose in sheets, and was almost to the corner when her boot broke through the hardened earth crust near the base of the foundation. She caught herself on the wall, heart hammering. She looked down. It was not a root. She knelt and scraped with her hands. The earth here was different, softer, darker, like fill rather than natural ground. She went back to her truck for her folding shovel and dug for 20 minutes before the blade struck something flat and metal. It took another hour to clear enough fill to see the whole thing. A trapdoor, roughly a meter square, set into a poured concrete surround that was clearly not original to the barn. The door itself was steel, painted dark green, with a recessed ring handle. The concrete around it was cracked by decades of Saskatchewan freeze-thaw cycles, but still largely intact. Clara sat back in the mud and looked at it for a long time. Then she got the pry bar from the truck. The ring handle had seized with rust, but didn't need a wheel. Just leverage and patience. She worked the bar into the seam around 3 edges, tapping it with a mallet, working the rust loose in sections. Her hands were blistering before the handle finally broke free with a sound like a rifle shot. She pulled the door open. Cold air sighed up out of the dark, dry, perfectly still air that had been sealed away for a very long time. Clara clicked on her headlamp and lowered the beam into the opening. The chamber below was small, maybe 3 meters by 4, walls and floor of poured concrete. And along the far wall, arranged in careful rows on a wooden shelf that had turned grey with age, were canvas sacks. Dozens of them, each stenciled with a date and a number in faded black ink. Beside the sacks, wrapped in oilcloth and stacked in wooden crates, were flat objects that looked at first like bricks. She climbed down the rough concrete steps, her boots scraping in the silence. She unwrapped the corner of one oilcloth bundle. Silver, a bar of silver hallmarked 1929, as solid and dense in her hand as a small engine block, cold the way only very old metal is cold. She picked up the nearest canvas sack. She already knew what was inside. The weight told her before she undid the drawstring. But she looked anyway, and there, spilling into her palm in the beam of her headlamp, were gold sovereigns. British gold sovereigns, dozens per sack, coins that Mykola Bilic had spent his life accumulating because he had watched too many of his neighbors trust the banks in 1929 and lose everything by 1932. He had built this chamber himself, under the barn he raised with his own hands, and he had never spent a coin of it, never told anyone outside the tightest family circle. The secret had passed from Mykola to his son Ivan, to his grandson Amos, growing quieter with each generation, until Amos had carried it almost all the way to his grave. Except not quite. He'd left the land to the one person he trusted to stay. What the earth holds, the earth keeps. Clara was still sitting on the concrete floor, surrounded by 90 years of buried savings, when the shadow fell across the opening above her. "I'll admit," Desmond said, "I expected it to take you longer." She looked up. He was standing at the rim, silhouetted against the September sky, and he was holding a hunting rifle at his side, with the casual familiarity of a man who had thought this through in advance. Clara's heartbeat went very quiet and very fast at the same time. "My grandfather found a reference to this chamber in township survey records from 1931, Desmond said, crouching at the edge. "A surveyor's notation, Bilic property, subsurface structure, estimated cash. My grandfather spent 30 years trying to get this land legally. My father spent another 20, and then the flooding started, and everyone assumed the chamber had been destroyed." He tilted his head. "You are exceptionally stubborn, Miss Whitfield." "I'm going to need you to leave my property," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "What you're going to do," Desmond said, "is put those sacks into the crates and hand them up to me, and then I'll leave, and this will all be finished." He let his eyes drop to the rifle for just a moment. The message was clear enough. The slough is still wet in the northeast corner. An accident out here wouldn't raise many questions. Clara looked around the chamber. The pry bar was on the ground 2 meters to her left. The folding shovel was up above, out of reach. There was a crate of silver bars beside her. There were steps behind her, but they led directly to him. What she had was the headlamp on her forehead. And what she remembered, from 4 days ago, working the pressure washer along this exact wall, was that the concrete surround of the trapdoor had a fracture running along its south edge, the kind of crack that forms when the ground underneath has shifted over a long, wet period. 6 years of heavy water table will do exactly that. She had filed the observation away without knowing why. She knew why now. "Desmond," she said clearly, "step back from the edge." He started to come down the first step instead. Clara grabbed the heaviest silver bar within reach and swung it hard against the south interior face of the concrete surround. 3 strikes, fast and deliberate, directly into the fracture line she'd spotted from outside. She felt the vibration travel through the wall. She heard Desmond shift his weight. Then the cracked section gave, not a collapse, maybe 30 centimeters of the rim crumbling outward, but Desmond was kneeling on that section when it went. He didn't fall into the chamber. He fell backward onto the September mud, and she heard the rifle discharge once into the sky, and then the sound of scrambling and swearing. Clara came up the steps fast, emerging into the grey afternoon with the pry bar in both hands. Desmond was on his back 4 meters away, winded badly. The rifle had skittered 2 meters from his hand. He was not a young man, and the fall had knocked the organization out of him. He started to push himself upright. "Don't," Clara said. He looked at her, her face, the distance to the rifle, and made the sensible decision. She walked to the rifle first, pushed it further away with her boot, and then pulled her phone from her jacket pocket. "This is Clara Whitfield, calling from the Whitfield homestead on County Road 9, Lacey County. I need the RCMP and an ambulance. I have a man on my property who threatened me with a firearm." She looked at Desmond steadily. "Tell them they'll also want to contact the Provincial Heritage Office. There's a significant find here." The RCMP arrived in under 20 minutes. Desmond Holtwick was taken into custody and charged with uttering threats, possession of a weapon for a dangerous purpose, and criminal harassment related to the months-long campaign of escalating calls. Federal charges were added later when investigators unwound the structure of Meridian Acquisitions and found that Desmond had been quietly acquiring neighboring parcels for 2 years, attempting to ring-fence the Whitfield property and compel a sale by isolation. What followed was 4 months of the most draining bureaucratic process Clara had ever endured. The province moved to classify the find as a significant archaeological site. The federal government raised questions about abandoned property. The Canada Revenue Agency had opinions about windfall taxation that made Clara briefly grip the edge of the table to steady herself. Morris brought in a colleague, Ingrid Okafor, 52, a heritage and property law specialist from Saskatchewan with exactly the kind of precise, unrelenting focus the situation required. Ingrid took the case on contingency and spent 2 months building her argument around 3 pillars. The coins and silver were legally minted and privately held prior to any federal currency restrictions. They were discovered within a structure that had been in continuous legal possession of the Whitfield family since 1924, and there was documented evidence: Mycola's letters, the 1931 survey notation, the family papers, establishing an unbroken chain of private ownership. The government's position relies on abandonment, Ingrid explained to Clara over coffee in Saskatoon in December. But abandoned property has no known owner. This property has a documented owner, you. The chamber was sealed by your ancestor on your ancestor's land and passed through clear inheritance to you. They can argue tax jurisdiction. They cannot argue title. The settlement came in February. The provincial and federal governments combined took 38% in heritage and windfall taxes. Ingrid's firm took their percentage. Morris took a modest fee. What remained, after the full treasury appraisal of 312 gold sovereigns and 41 silver bars at current market rates, was just over $6.4 million. Nigel drove up from Calgary on a Thursday in April. He arrived at the homestead, newly fenced, the barn roof repaired, the farmhouse foundation stabilized and under renovation, in a car that was noticeably less impressive than his usual. He'd mentioned on the phone that the tech company he'd invested in had not performed the way the prospectus suggested, and that the house in the Mount Royal neighborhood was now the subject of some complicated discussions with the bank. He stood on the newly poured driveway and looked at what had become of the drowned graveyard he'd written off 14 months ago. "Clara," he said, composing himself carefully. You really did it. This is something." "Hello, Nigel," she said from the porch. She did not invite him inside. "I know we weren't exactly on the same page at Morris's office. he started, coming toward the steps. But you have to understand, I was looking at it practically. Anyone would have said the Sammerly, right? We're the only Whitfields left. Grandpa Amos would have wanted us to. Nigel. She said it the way you say a name when you're done with the argument that comes before it. Grandpa Amos knew exactly what was in this ground. He left the land to me because he trusted me to stay with it. He left you the truck and the account because he knew you were going to tell me to sell it to a corporate acquisition firm for $60,000 and walk away clean. Nigel opened his mouth, closed it. You told me this was a liability, Clara said. You told me I was being sentimental. You stopped calling after the first month because you'd already decided how this story ended. She came down one step, just one, and looked at him directly. Amos left you your share. He was fair to you. I'm not going to be unfair, but I'm also not going to pretend we were in this together when we weren't. She reached into the planter she'd built beside the steps. Good Saskatchewan soil, turned and composted, ready for spring, and picked up a small handful. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, then let it fall through her fingers back where it belonged. The land doesn't forget what you put into it, Nigel, she said, and neither do I. She turned and walked back into the farmhouse, and the heavy oak door closed behind her with a sound that was completely final. That evening, Clara sat in the kitchen, not the original kitchen which had been gutted by years of water, but the new one, open to the restored timber frame of the original structure, and poured herself a cup of tea. Through the west window she could see the threshing barn in the low April light, its foundation stones solid against the earth. The chamber beneath it had been properly excavated, documented by heritage researchers, and then sealed again. At Clara's request, they had placed a small plaque at the entrance, Mikola Bialik Whitfield, 1889 to 1951. He put it here, and the land kept it. The slough still sat in the northeast corner, smaller now, a proper seasonal wetland rather than a flood. There were ducks on it. Amos would have liked that. There are moments when everything you've lost, the marriage, the money, the years you thought you were building something with someone who turned out to be building something else entirely, arranges itself differently in your memory. And you can see that none of it was wasted because it made you the person who could stand in the mud on a September afternoon with a pry bar in your hands and refuse to leave. Clara sat with her tea and watched the light go off the barn in stages, gold to amber to the flat grey of dusk. She was still technically in debt. The renovation had cost more than she'd budgeted. But the foundation was solid, the soil was good, and come spring she was putting in a market garden on the southeast quarter. The land doesn't forget. So here's the question we want to leave you with today. If every person you trusted told you to walk away, if the numbers, the logic, and every practical voice around you said to let it go, would you have the courage to stay? Clara did. And she stayed not because she knew what was coming, but because she couldn't bring herself to let go of what her grandfather had held on to for her. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Would you have held on or taken the money and run? Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to Claim the Drama for more stories just like this one. We'll see you in the next one.